So you're probably familiar with this concept of maybe shooting when you go ready, aim, fire. My point of view is you need to dispel that totally. You want to go ready, fire, aim, right? Because, well, if you go ready, aim, fire, and you're in a complex business environment with lots of changes going on, you will never get to the fire. You'll go ready, aim, oh, aim some more, aim a bit more. Are we really sure? No, aim a bit more.
Welcome, everybody, to this edition of the Optimal Leadership podcast. I'm delighted today to be joined by Professor Steve Wyatt from the University of Bath Business School of Management in the UK. Steve's a professor in leadership and strategy. Steve's a best-selling author as well, and his recent book, Antidote to the Crisis of Leadership, Opportunity in Complexity, is indeed another bestseller. So, Steve, great to have you on the conversation today.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about it. And your book's about crisis in leadership. So that suggests that leadership needs to change. Steve, maybe we dive straight in. What exactly needs to change in leadership?
Well, hopefully we've got enough tape on this podcast because that's a very long topic. So there are some fundamentals which in leadership which don't really change. Probably will never change, right? So, Robert Hogan said it really well, but the four fundamental things which don't really change. You need to have a really great vision, right? You need to have great judgment. You need to have great integrity. But a lot of other aspects of how to lead are context dependent. In fact, there's a whole body of work around situational leadership which really makes that explicit. There is context dependency, and there is very little that the current context in which we operate has in common with the context, say, 50 years ago. So if we accept the truth that leadership is context dependent and the context has changed significantly, then the aspects and how we do leadership must change in order to be effective in this.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I was just wondering then, you mentioned the context changing, so leadership needs to change. So you say maybe the it's the quality of leadership that's the problem, that leadership is the constraint. And now, of course, you mentioned the environment, the context is changing. So we often talk about the world becoming more volatile. And so do you think that we're applying, where we're struggling to adapt, is it because we're applying a linear thinking to non-linear situations?
So let me give a bit of flavor. So you said volatility. So the way that I look at that is a lot of people say the world's a lot more complex now. I would actually slightly nuance that. I don't think the world's necessarily more complex. I think we have greater visibility of the complexity. And why do we have greater visibility on the complexity? Because more things, aspects of the context in which we operate, are changing simultaneously more quickly.
Okay, got it.
And therefore, it's more evident to us that there is these systemic relationships, which we can't really map. The model's too complicated, the second and third order implications and so forth. So there's a greater awareness of systemic complexity now. And therefore, it may have been there for a long period of time, but we weren't being confronted by it because you didn't have changes going that was so dramatic, so quickly in so many different spaces simultaneously. So the complexity was more latent, if you like, whereas now it's very visible. So I think the first thing I would say is the context has changed in that there is greater visibility and necessity to engage with systemic complexity, right? So that's kind of one thing. I think another major shift that's gone on is the idea that leaders are distant or in somehow protected by their position. So we now have greater visibility, transparency, and that is fed or fueled by also a greater expectation from, I'm going to call them loosely followers, but you can call them stakeholders, whichever one you want, to scrutinize what's going on with leaders rather than have, the CEO, the boss, the chairman, things like this, and that's all good. No, now there's a greater expectation to scrutinize what's happening. And that's, I think, partly from a sense of dependency Do I want to work at this organization?
Mm.
If I will only know if I want to work at this organization if I can understand what the values are of someone else. Do I believe that this organization is going to be around into the future and therefore give me job security? Is it going to get tarnished with something that I don't want, some scandal that I don't want to be attached to, and so forth? So there is a degree of dependency, greater awareness of that dependency, as well as an increased a reduction of the level of trust in the individuals. Like before, historically, potentially, we turned a blind eye, didn't really care what leaders were doing.
Mm.
Now we really do. What have they been saying in their tweets, or whatever you call it, and what did they say multiple years ago, and where are they going? So there is that scrutiny, visibility, dependency that's there, and I think it's got its two sides to it. One is there are the mechanisms for that, and the other is greater expectations from the followers. So I think those are a couple of the big things that have changed.
Just reflecting on your comments there, I think there's there is a lot of complexity in the world, and I guess maybe in the past as leaders we try to get a lot of control over the external environment, but this theme that you mentioned of Aspire suggests that a level of inner awareness, self-awareness, is more important than ever with leaders. Do you think that it's the leadership crisis that you mentioned is maybe because it's not because of lack of leadership skill, but perhaps it's just taking time to have this level of self-awareness that's even more important, given that the world is so much more aware than ever before of what leaders are doing?
Okay, I'm not sure those are indistinguishable. In a world where you've got increased visibility of this complexity, and just put that down to a couple of very simple things. Imagine the world as it used to be, which is not actually quite true, but we like to romance it. The 40 years ago, people cared a lot about, let's say, call it the profitability of the organization, the economic and the returns to shareholders, whatever. And then we had a whole phase of triple bottom line, where we've got to think about societal needs as well, right? Well, just that expression, that step, which is by itself out of date, already said you go from one key performance metric for the organization to three performance metrics, right? And now if we extend that to the current context where you've got multiple societal welfare, well-being measures for the performance of an organization or a CEO, you can see how the complexity is much more visible now, right? So when you overlay on top of that this transparency, visibility, expectations, or as I put it, the dependency, the expectation for dependency from the follower group, followers, customers, employees, whatever you want to call it, investors. What it then happens is that a CEO who is not equipped will feel a massive pressure to please everybody on everything all the time. And when they realize they can't do that, because no one can do that, the consequences of a misstep, a perceived misstep by one of the subgroups on one of the things at one point in time can blow up massively in their face in the media, and they have to do mea culpa, and they have to make an apology, or they might even have to resign or whatever, right? So the pressures on them for not keeping everybody happy on everything all the time are much, much higher, right? So the first thing you see is that there's this need for management across multiple different metrics. That's just the context changed. And then you see that the pressure for them to actually be across those multiple contexts is much higher. A consequence of these two things together is that fewer people in leadership positions take decisions. Right? Either they were great at taking decisions in more benign environments, and so they want to continue with that model going forward, and they just can't deal with all these other things they don't know, so they try and outsource those decisions to other consultants or advisors. They don't own it any longer. Or they're scared of taking decisions in this high level of complexity because of the exposure and the downside risks, right? And so if you can, so these things go together, therefore, back to your question, I was about to go off in a different direction there, but anyway, to back to your question, therefore, how does this get it? So if you, as a leader, don't really know what your values are, what you're aspiring to achieve, you don't have a compass to navigate by.
Yeah.
Right? You'll basically be going, stakeholders I think are more important to this, but I also know that I'm going to get fired if I make a mistake over here. I'll be hedging my bets, trying to be the nice guy all over, and I won't be leading. Right? So you've got to be comfortable knowing, well, first you have to know, and then comfortable taking decisions on what your personal set of values are and purpose are, and live that out. And when that upsets some group of people, you can still sleep at night.
Yeah, you made me think about a number of different things there, Steve. So where to start? I mean, keeping everyone happy on everything all of the time. You remind me of times where we tried to reflect that in like annual targets for people. Whether at the senior level or through the organization or for the negotiating my own targets as a CEO. And then you can easily end up with 20 targets, and then of course none of them are targets because they don't target the work. So you helped me to see the kind of the just through one lens of that, just how difficult it is. And then you got me thinking that maybe one of the reasons that a crisis can actually be quite attractive for leaders is that in a time of crisis you have to forget all of that and really focus on what is the most important. And it does legitimize keeping everyone happy on everything all of the time when the time comes, and it maybe just is customers that need to get all of your attention because there's a crisis related to those. And so maybe this sort of fair weather leading is more complicated. Maybe perhaps we're less likely to make bold decisions in fair weather than when something's gone wrong. I don't know whether you've experienced that at all.
Well, I think most of us experienced the COVID, right? And multiple insights about leadership came from that. The wait and hope approach, wrong. Right. So that was very clear. If that was your mentality, we've got our 5-year plan. Hopefully, it's only going to be 3 months. It's hopefully 6 months, and then it'll go back to quote normal. That was almost every company that I've worked with or interviewed as a leader of, that was the wrong approach. Right. So leaders needed to show up at that time. So therefore, I agree with you. In an existential crisis or an environment like that, then you need to be seen to be acting on the things you can act on, given that the context has changed, and therefore you need to be present. However, post-COVID, what do we learn? We learn that people like to do analyses of how great were the decisions you took at that time. And in fact, they're not really asking the question, how great were the decisions you took at that time? What they're really asking was, what are the 3-year later, 5-year later, second order, third order consequences of the fact you took a decision? Why didn't you model the future to the nth degree and figure out that there could be a downside risk of this? So the expectations are wrong, but this navel gazing that goes on post, which can lead to very high pressure, be it real or invented by chatbots on social media or whatever, is further fueling the anxiety of leaders, people in leadership positions, to actually take leadership decisions in the current context. Because no one ever knows the future. You certainly don't know the future in a complex systemic situation. So I think some of these investigations are asking the wrong questions. We should be saying, given what we knew at the time, given what you knew at the time, did you go through a good process? Was it well intentioned? Right. And did you involve the right people in it, for example? And did you make the decisions in a timely manner? What could have been worse? Right. So how good was what you did in comparison to worse outcomes? Rather than, as I said, just looking at the 3 years later, second order consequences and so forth. So I think the expectation that somehow leaders can take great decisions in a timely manner without knowing the future is a part of the educated society that we need society to grow up as well in order to enable leaders to morph and evolve their role.
Mm, mm.
Because,
It does get increasingly difficult for leaders because the tools available for all stakeholders to analyze performance after the event, after the leadership tenure has finished, I guess, are greater than ever before. It was certainly
yeah,
for me, it was quite a good learning as I moved through CEO roles to, well, at least to realize early on that, you know, there will be some. For want of a better expression, an audit of the leadership, an audit of the time in the post that will happen, whether it's through regulators, whether it's through the board, whether it's by the media. And I think just getting used to that as a CEO is that, you know, you look back over your shoulder, even if you don't, other people will be, and making judgments. I think it's great to be aware of that while you're in the post. That even if overall it's a
yeah,
success, and there's plenty to be learned as well
yeah.
from.
We should definitely have high standards, which we expect to hold people in leadership positions to, for the responsibilities that they take and how they execute their office.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And which is the nuance, because what I'm saying is that you you don't know the future. So we go back to the fundamentals of leadership, which I said right at the beginning, or one of the four is judgment,
Mm,
right? So you need to have judgment, right? And not everybody has great judgment, so we need to identify that. But also in judgment, which is really, I think, one of the things that I've become increasingly aware of for the last 10 years, is that there are very, very few decisions that, once taken, cannot be adjusted or reversed.
mm, mm.
So the idea that, as we don't have data on the future, but we're going to somehow take timely decisions, which are always going to be 100% the best decision, never needing to be revisited, that's just simply bonkers, right?
Yeah,
So we should have an expectation that you have great process, you are responsible for your office, you take decisions in a timely manner to move the organization forward, and then, as they say in the army, you keep thinking to the finish.
mm,
You don't take a decision and run away. And so we need to help educate the organization, the workforce, the shareholders, the public, whatever it happens to be, that leaders are there to take decisions and move forward, and then continue to adjust and refine as more data arrives from the future.
yeah, yeah. And sometimes the data arrives as we start to move, I guess. And you
Absolutely.
remind me of one of my leadership experiences where there was a crisis situation, and our tendency was potentially not to make decisions and not to act fast enough. So for a while, we introduced a three-legged speed-related mantra of fast decision, inevitably some fast mistakes, but then some fast recovery, and
Yeah.
and that really that's not always the right steady state, but in certain situations we found that mantra really helped us to move and mobilize and take action, because in a situation where taking no action was probably going to be the worst decision.
Yeah. So taking no action generally is bad, for a whole variety of motivational issues, energy issues, dissipation, and so forth, right? And anxiety that is created through that. Change also creates anxiety. So the language I use in this, and I have to sometimes apologize because I know I use a lot of military esque language in this, in my work, but it's a function of background and who I work with. But so you're probably familiar with this concept of maybe shooting, when you go ready, aim, fire. My point of view is you need to dispel that totally. You want to go ready, fire, aim, right? Because if you go ready, fire, aim, well, if you go ready, aim, fire, and you're in a complex business environment with lots of changes going on, you will never get to the fire. You'll go ready, aim, oh, aim some more, aim a bit more. Are we really sure? No, aim a bit more. Oh, we might get around to firing, right? If you do ready, fire, aim, you take a decision, you get on with it, and you still have responsibility to adjust,
Yeah.
course correct, right? So that means that people are feeling energized. They can see things going forward, right? So I'm not saying you're just being irresponsible. You're being highly responsible because you're moving the organization forward, and you've got the idea of agility, or as I prefer to call it, adaptability in the organization. And so this concept of, anyway, so one of the cultural concepts and the languages that I try to put into the organization I work with as a coach is, yeah, ready, fire, aim.
Yeah, I can see huge benefit in that. Sounds completely counterintuitive, but it clearly makes a lot of sense. To respond to what happens after we've taken a couple of shots. Yeah.
So one of the wasn't
No,
running
no,
on that.
sorry.
The
Yeah, no, no.
one of the builds of that is when you look at the multiple changes that are happening in the current concept, which I call the fourth industrial revolution. I mean, not only me, the World Economic Forum and many other people call it the fourth industrial revolution. In this context, we used to have a dominant logic in management, which was called risk avoidance through careful planning. So we were fearful of making a mistake, right? So we would have, how good's this option versus that option? Have you thought through this scenario, that scenario, plus or minus 10, and what could go wrong, and all the kind of good stuff, right? That's the ready, aim, fire stuff. And does it going to hit the high? Is this project going to hit the hurdle rates? Anyway, that's going to get me down a whole different story. But no one knows the future, so you may as well just make up the numbers to hit the hurdle rates anyway, right? Because no one knows the future. But that's not. So the firm's value was somehow correlated to essentially risk avoidance. And good governance was linked to helping the CEO, etc., not endorse poorly thought out projects. Right? That was the dominant model and economic model. Where we are now is that actually it's not the fear of making a mistake, it's the fear of missing out, which is more important, right? Because you've got so much change going on in the organization, well, in the context in which the organization operates, as well as potentially within the organization. If you miss out on, you don't move quickly enough, you'll miss out on opportunities for internal process to be improved and enhanced, opportunities in the marketplace. You're going to miss out. And so the FOMO is taken over from risk avoidance, right? Now, FOMO means that you should have an impetus to actually take decisions faster, right? But you need to therefore have responsibility for ready, fire, aim, course correcting going on. Otherwise, you're not being responsible. So you need to be in the FOMO. And to play that through, how does that work out? Well, if you look at price earnings ratios average on the stock market, right? Back in the day when they were 8, 12, whatever, price earning ratio on average for the market, that's because it was from fear of missing out. I'm sorry, the fear of making a mistake. We would basically have forecasts, which we would. Increasingly in the modern market, there's a much higher price earnings ratio. There's a much higher value put on the future. At the same time, the future we all recognize is less well known.
Yeah.
Right. So this whole investor community is putting more stay on the future, which is recognized to be unknown. Right. So if you want to be optimizing firm value, you have to be having a very clear vision and creating confidence for the investor community and employees and talent and all the rest of you who want to come to your organization that you will thrive in this future, which is decreasingly known. Right. And this is what gives rise to this thing which was called the unicorns a few years ago, right? And the unicorns were, these firms which hadn't created any profit and yet had a valuation of more than $1 billion. And they were unicorns because there were so few of them around. They were mythical creatures because it defied logic of the stock market. As of December 25, the last time I looked at the number, could be changed by now, there was more than 1,600 unicorns out there, right? That's a herd. That's not a mythical creature, right? So that's the extreme example. But if you look even at the stock market PE ratio on average, it's moved higher. And that's an indication of investors are looking for firms or organizations which they believe are going to thrive in the future which is decreasingly understood because the rate of change is going on, right? So that's the macro context in which leaders now have to lead. And that's why it's so different from the environment that was before, maybe from the environment their mentors were at when they were at business school, when they learned from professors who wrote case studies like myself. They were learning always in a different context or from that. And this context you have to operate in now just requires a very different set of skills.
Given the importance of being able to move fast in an uncertain environment, I guess partners are important because CEOs can't know all the answers, and there's something to be said maybe for aligning with others. I know you talk about this concept of ally in your book. Can you say a little bit more? Is this about moving away from CEOs being authoritative and knowing the answers to maybe being able to influence wide groups of others who can be helped and be influenced by other people who can able to help to maybe set a good direction, perhaps with more certainty. What's the role of partnerships for a leader nowadays?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot we can unpack in that as well. Okay, so why do I call it allyship? Call it allyship, and I'll give you a few my one-line sound bites on this. So, if leadership is lonely, you're doing it wrong.
Right.
That's kind of one of my favorite ones.
Yeah.
Right? And leadership is increasingly a team sport. Right. So these are a couple of my sort of throwaway lines. But look, the issue really is, as you said, as a great leader. So let's build on one of the things you talked about influence, right? So influence. So about, where are we now? Yeah. So about 30, 35 years ago, there was this repositioning of, or the evolution of some of the thinking about leadership to have it on in an influence model. Right? You can influence others around you, and I think that's a good move forward. That's not quite the same as moving to a team sport, but it is this idea that we have. It's a relationship that matters, right? Now, in the environment which we're in, where the systemic complexity moves very fast, and as we talked about before, you as a leader need to focus on the process of getting to decisions, and getting alignment for the implementation and follow through of those decisions, recognizing that they are going to be revisited and course corrected. Right. So that's a tension. Like, some people just like to go, well, what's the decision? We signed up for that. It's in the 5-year strat plan. Let's go with that. It's like, well, those days are gone, my friend. So we need to get alignment. We need to get great discussion going, but we also need to have maturity in that group that things are going to change. So that means we need to treat the inner circle, the circle that we work with, however in or outer that is, but that circle we need to treat with maturity. Right. There is a challenge which we don't know the answer to.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be able to. We're not going to take a democratic or whatever, we're not going to take a decision around the table. However, we take a decision, and that's going to alleviate the members of this team, the top leadership team, from responsibility for thinking about this in the future. No. Sorry, guys. We're all going to have to face into this issue. It's a real issue for us to work on and work through. So, this idea of adult-to-adult interactions, bringing the right people in. They may not be permanent members of the team because you may have particular issues you want to get confronted, but you've got to network the best insights possible into a process which you curate as a leader. It does lead to a decision, so that equals you've got to have skin in the game. You've got to take some responsibility for that. You can't say, well, the consultants told me to do that. It's McKinsey's fault. You've got to take some responsibility for that, and you can't fire and forget. You've got to, sorry, back to my military thing. You've got to be course correcting and keeping ownership of that. Think through to the finish. So that makes it a team game, right? Because again, around the table, around the room, whatever the group you've got, if you're thinking to the finish, that means that somebody maybe on the front line, customer service or something, may be spotting something that's happening. They need to be able to bring that through to challenge or to help course correct previous decisions with all the things that we know from like psychological safety and so forth, without thinking they're being against the team because there's a decision taken previously and so forth. Actually, it's part of everybody's responsibility to help the organization think through to the finish. And you've got to do that in a way that's not reversing decisions arbitrarily or stopping things. So you have to have that momentum, but it's a momentum that's improving and adjusting, course correcting, rather than revisiting because you didn't want to do it. It's not like the 15th time you ask the Australians, do they still want to have a monarchy? It's the same question every time. But so you've got to have that view, which is we're on this together and we're changing that. We're all required to be engaged in thinking to the finish.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Your comments about leadership being a team sport do resonate, and then involving everyone in the team in making the leadership decisions and continuing to course correct as we go. These are probably obvious things for people who play in teams, right? You start out with a game plan, and then you adjust. Yeah, I'm sure for many team players, it's that's exactly what they would expect. You have a plan, and then the moment the game starts, the plan goes out of the window. And it's just my two favorite team sports are football, 11 player team sport, and chess, which I often felt was a 16 player team sport rather than individual sport. But I'm not quite sure on that one. It's
Right.
but it's certainly your comments really resonating, Steve, about the need to move quickly. I remember 15 to 20 years ago leading a business in China, and to put together a plan for China could take a long time, but and you don't have a long time, right? You just have to keep moving, because the time we had a plan for China would have, we could have lost 3 months, and the whole context would have changed. And so that, you really brought back to me that need to be planning, to have a game plan, but to keep shifting it as the context changes. Are there any examples of organizations or leaders that have done really well in this regard that you could share, Steve?
Well, so I think as I said, during the pandemic, it was there's plenty of examples of companies which have moved well there. In China, there was a lot of garment manufacturers, for example, like Dalian Leather, for example. They were surprisingly in a fashion industry, and that industry with mainly retail outlets, and that whole sector disappeared overnight because people couldn't go outside their houses and couldn't go to shops and go to retail, and they had to pivot. So they pivoted really, really quickly into, of course, protective clothing, because it was an allied area, but had different supply chains, different manufacturing techniques, and so forth, different customers that it was going for. It's that kind of pivot, which was driven, to your earlier point, by an external situation that said, just do it, otherwise we're not going to survive. Anyway, through that pivot, then you realize that actually your real strengths are in your ability to pivot. Right. So when I say that, for example, reconfigure a manufacturing line becomes more important than optimizing a manufacturing line. Business as usual is about optimization, right? Whereas pivoting is about being able to redesign, reconfigure, retrain people, right? And so when you get out of the pandemic, coming out the other side, the question is, do you go back to what you're doing before? Do you stay with the new that you're doing, or how do you go forward as a business? And what those guys realized is that actually they had this strength of ability to pivot. So, the protective clothing they got into was probably going to go down because of the end of the COVID thing. So pivot away from that. But did they need to pivot back to what they were doing before? Well, maybe not. They could pivot somewhere else. So they started different lines of manufacture and so forth, and really expanded out. And they really became conscious of these skills for changing and pivoting and reading what's going on in order to spawn a whole bunch of new businesses. So I use that as an example. It's a little contained, but it's very clear from that example the kind of lessons and implications that they need to take over. Your skill set moves from, like I said, manufacturing skills or low-cost production or whatever happens to be, or HR management, from those things which help you improve all the time, business as usual. Your real skills, your real source of, in strategy speak, we would call sustainable competitive advantage. So your sustainable competitive advantage comes from your ability to continuously pivot.
Got it. So, you're moving towards one of my favorite theses, that it's the culture that's important. And here you're talking about it, I guess, a particular value, adaptability, or the ability to pivot at the organizational level, particularly in such turbulent times. But then at the individual leader level, do you see anything in particular that distinguishes leaders that are able, say, to thrive in uncertain times and turbulent times, as distinct from leaders who perhaps just able to survive through volatile times?
Well, so the language, the one-liner on this is, the leaders need to spend a lot more time working on the business rather than in the business.
Right.
You've probably heard that kind of before, but the distillation of that, or the packaging around that, is sort of the following: that we've always had this idea that leaders need to work on the business and some of the time in the business. Probably historically, we would do the on the business during the strategy plan every 3 years, or whatever it was going to be, and the rest of the time we're in the business because we're making sure that staff get paid, sales forecasts are achieved, and so on and so forth, right? And so, rough figures, it was probably 10% on the business and 90% in the business, right? current environment means that you're going to be spending a much higher percentage of your time working on the business.
Okay.
And that requires a different mentality. So let's say the ratio is about 50-50 now, right? So you still have to make sure the wheels don't fall off, but you're changing course and you're pivoting and so forth a lot more. Now it's 50-50. Some people's mentality is much more, they are much more comfortable with certainty and stability, optimization, making sure the wheels don't come off. Right? And if the task now is a real leadership task, is 50-50, working on versus in the business, those types of individuals are just going to struggle by leaning into uncertainty. Right? So neuroscience says that we've all got different makeups, and some people like certainty more. So yeah, those kind of people are going to struggle in this kind of environment, right? They're going to be perhaps more suited to being leaders in an environment which is much more stable than being in, I'm not sure, let's say maybe in civil service or in a monopoly utility kind of environment. I'm sure there are definitely changes going on in those things, but the rate of change is going to be very different in that kind of environment to, say, a small service firm right now or a tech firm and so forth, right? So if you've got a psychological makeup which says you like certainty, then probably you need to be more choiceful now about which sectors you're going to be in if you're going to be a leader, right? So I think that's a play how I play that one out. I do think that the skill set you need to be working on your business to see things is not only about certain psychological makeup and having less certainty required, but does require you to be able to see more broadly. So Steve Jobs' famous expression on this is more dots, better dots. But basically, see more broadly things which may not appear connected. You need to be looking above the parapet, not at the dashboard of your business. And then your brain is going the whole time about how these things might come together. And then you'll be able to join some of these dots up and recognize a new pattern, a new opportunity, and so forth, right? So there is also a skill set of what I call sensing and making sense, which is much more valuable in higher speed evolving sectors or contexts than previously. Previously, maybe the dashboard was all good. You could look at your KPIs, how we're doing, and you're much more internal. Now, to sense and make sense, you've got to be looking externally. You've got to be connected externally. You've got to be absorbing points, not just waiting for the industry sector report, which is always a rear view mirror report on how you and your traditional, similar looking, sounding competitors are behaving. That's fine, but that's a different era, right? Now you want to be looking perhaps in completely tangential directions and what other business models are out there that could be useful, or how customers evolving that are non-traditional customers. So you need to be looking broadly. What we do also know about looking broadly from the leader point of view is you need to do it firsthand.
Okay.
Right. So you need to be connecting and having conversations. They'll make a lot more sense to you and what you want to trigger, rather than relying on the strategy team or outsourcing to somebody else, right? So there's a lot more personal involvement in that connectivity. So sensing, making sense, super, super important. And what's your personal level of certainty that you require? That's just based on your neuroscience makeup. You've got to find the environment where you can thrive.
Thanks, Steve. That leads me on really neatly to the final area I wanted to explore with you, which I know is one of your favorite topics, and that's the theme of accountability. Because particularly in these fast-moving environments where there's uncertainty, volatility, we're relying on others, we're engaging with others, and yet CEOs still need to be accountable. Can you say a little about how CEOs really can make themselves and can hold themselves accountable in such rapidly changing times?
Well, again, many different ways we could skin that, but you can't be accountable for much else than yourself.
Okay.
Right. So you've got to start first and foremost with yourself, right? If you can't lead yourself in this kind of environment where you need to have vision and purpose and values, which you live by, if you can't hold on to that, it's going to be harder for others to want to follow you or consistently follow you, right? You might take a poor decision, or you might arrive at a poor decision, and that might be implemented, but you've got to hold yourself to account for at least having gone through the right process.
Right. Okay.
Right. You can, if you haven't gone through the right process of engagement, getting input from the right people, taking timely action, timely decisions, and conversations, then you have no leg to stand on, I would argue, when decisions don't work out. So the first and foremost part of accountability has to be accountable to yourself for the values, the process that you've been, the behaviors you've come up with. What are you role modeling? What's the culture of an organization? And we always say this, that the culture of an organization is the shadow of the leader, right? So you have to be accountable for how you're showing up and what your behavior set is, how the decisions have been taken, how they've been revisited. That's what you're accountable for. We don't know the future, and yet we're taking decisions for it. Therefore, it's almost impossible there will always be perfect outcomes, right? We can't control that. But what we can control is, did the process, who we behave, were we thinking, did we make sure that the culture of the organization the culture of the organization ensured we were thinking through to the finish, thinking all the time, course correcting as we went, right? That's what we are fully responsible, accountable for. Does some government policy change that destroys our business model? Maybe. But what do we do about it? Did we just sit there and cry? Did we respond? Had we thought through a scenario process before and what we would do should that vulnerability account? We're responsible for that. We're not responsible for did the policy change or not? Did Trump change his things or not? Like, whether or not something outside of our control has happened, we're not responsible for that. But we are responsible for, had we thought through in a coherent way what our response could be, scenario planning kind of thing, how we would mitigate risk. Or if we hadn't prepared, which we can't prepare for everything, right? Did we then have the right process in place to take the best decisions that we could in a timely manner at that time, given that eventuality had happened, right? So accountability, first and foremost, is personal. So I always say, it's personal accountability for collective performance.
Okay, got it. One of the areas that I guess leaders can take accountability for is their own development, their own learning, and you use the term accelerate in your book, and as far as I can pick up, a big part of that is leaders needing to be curious, needing to continue to learn, to stay in touch with the context. Can you say a little bit more about leaders and how they should go about continuing to learn?
Yeah. Well, so we touched on a couple of things already. So this idea of sensing and making sense and working on the business. So that means that you've got to have this orientation to be looking outside the business or outside the organization that you're in to engage directly and personally with other context and environments. So that's so that all ties together very much there. You've got to make an effort for that. I think beyond that, there's also this requirement that we are thinking about how we are challenging ourselves or allowing others to challenge us, right? So if we find that I don't know, we've got higher staff turnover than we would aspire for, then we would want to have the question of, is that linked to the culture? Am I part of that culture? Or hold the mirror up to me. Don't just do an outsource. It's someone else's problem to fix the culture. We need to have we need to establish our own processes and connections to be looking outside the firm. But we also need to establish a personal board which will lean into giving us constructive feedback, reflection about how we're showing up, the impact we're having. I'll give you a small example, actually, from my own life on that. But it's I used to run quite a large sales organization in Asia when I was based in Asia, and across the whole region, and we were, of course, great and hitting all of our numbers. That was all good. But so one time I am in a taxi to a client with one of our account directors, who's 3 or 4 levels below me. And so what was fascinating was at some point she said, "I've really enjoyed this chat with you in the car. I've got to know you really well. It's so completely different to what I've experienced in the firm so far." I said, "Well, that's really interesting. What do you mean by that?" "Of course, I'm a nice guy." She goes, "Yeah, but key staff members, like the chief of staff and a couple others, they're really like attack dogs. Like they're barking away and they're really quite terrifying. So I thought about that for a while, and I went and talked to everybody, and I found out what was going on. So the culture that was going through the organization was permeated by the people who protected me the most, my inner circle, because they could see how stressed we were. They were celebrating on the success and so forth. But as a result of that, they were putting through this not culture of fear, but obviously a culture of intimidation, more broadly in the organization. And then I realized that I needed to have someone like this lady who would be able to give me feedback to. So I actually understood what the culture was, because at some point, the culture is the shadow of the leader. And whether or not that's how I position myself and thought about myself, it doesn't really matter. It's about how it's perceived. And so having that piece, that insight was very helpful. And then I could go out and actually have explicit change in my behavior, be much more aware of my behavior, even within people who I'd known for years and were, loyalists, and we got on really, really well. My inner circle, they needed to manage that culture for a bigger thing. So to be humble and learning, we need to be looking outside, but we also need to have a panel who keeps us honest and gives us real feedback internally, so we can keep learning on that side as well. I think there are then a number of techniques one can go through that, but one of the ones I always say that as you need to get into place is, do you have the self-discipline, right? Or do you, to leaders, oftentimes, leaders think that they're putting up this fantastic facade, and and how they are in a private setting or in their family is just so completely different to how they are at work. And at work, they're just so professional. It's like, you're just not being authentic, then, are you? I mean, that's kind of what's going on. And the thing is, in today's environment with social media and postings and ad hoc comments in taxis or whatever happens to be, the truth will always leak out. So who are you really? Not who do you want to tell yourself you are? So I think there's the third aspect. So one is external looking, one is having a panel, and the other is some really deep work with individual leaders to find out who they really are, and the narrative they tell themselves. And I think there's quite a lot of work that's required to be done on that. To put that in numbers, about in all the sort of coaching, etc., interventions that I don't do traditional coaching. I do business advisory work, but I work with CEOs on that. I would go with that. In my experience, it's about a fifth, maybe even a quarter, but at least a fifth of senior leaders have some quite deep trauma somewhere in their background, and that injury, psychological injury, will show up in how they operate. Sometimes you need to look in the mirror. I mean, have someone help you look in the mirror, figure it out.
And what one particularly interesting comment you made a couple of times is about the culture being the shadow of the leader. And so it is a way, perhaps, for leaders to be able to see themselves is to step back and look at the culture of the organization. I was certainly aware that, and I was never in a CEO role for more than 4.5 years, but I was well aware that, in various roles, that the organization was starting to look more and more like me after a certain period of time, and I feel my fingerprints run it. And and so it's not a shadow that appears instantly. It's one that sort of starts to mold itself around the CEO. I think probably within a period of less than a year. And so I think you're giving us a good insight there. Maybe to finish, Steve, when you're looking at leaders and you consult to many, you teach many. If you were in this area of leadership crisis, saying there's one area where leaders could really look in the mirror, and you see it time and time again, where it's the leaders need to pay more attention to themselves rather than to the context. What's that one thing that stands out more and repeatedly to you, where leaders can recognize that maybe they're part of the problem and need to change, and how might that be?
Yeah. So let me weave in finally a polo analogy for you, right? So that I think I told you I used to play polo semi-professionally, and one thing was so I would play with some amazing players, like really skilled, much better than me, and so there's particularly one guy from New Zealand, and so I had him up on my staff, and I said, could you give some lessons to these other beginner-ish, early stages polo play folks, right? So he gets to run his horse. He's running around and hitting the ball and doing this kind of good stuff. And I debriefed with the, I don't call them students, they weren't students, but these people afterwards. And I said, what did you learn? He said, we've got a long way to go. Secondly, he's a really nice guy. I said, well, what did you learn? He said, absolutely nothing. There's nothing we can do. So I went up to this guy and I said, how did you teach them? What were you doing? And he goes, well, I would show them what to do. And I said, just do like this. I'm going like, okay, so here's a problem, right? And the problem is the following. Natural talent isn't easily replicated because you don't really know what you're doing and you can't really explain what you're doing. And so in the leadership context, how does this link? It links the following way. The majority of senior executives that I come across who are in leadership positions, I'm choiceful with my language, don't know in a disciplined way how to be effective leaders. Right? So they've not trained on leadership in a way that's allowed them to develop a repertoire, have structured feedback on themselves, and develop a sophisticated today's context relevant set of skills and tools about how to be effective in this environment. Most people have grown up in an organization, multiple organizations, whatever. They've done okay. They've managed to learn from a few hard knocks. The results were okay and so forth. They've absorbed. They may have had mentors. They may have done some business school thing, and they kind of got to where they are, and it's great. The problem is they're like my polo playing friend, right? They can't really explain what works and what doesn't work to other people. And when the context has changed significantly, they only know how to play one way. Right? They don't know because they haven't had that big repertoire of experience and coaching and support and all the rest of it in order to get better. So, and because the stakes are so high for them for getting it wrong, they have a very high propensity to stick with what's worked for them before. So, there's an old expression from Marshall Goldsmith, which is, what got you here won't get you there. Well, that's very true as the context changed. So let's say someone's in their 40s, 50s, whatever, and they're in a senior position in the company, and they've grown there obviously over the last 20, 30 years, whatever. They are generally, as a species, unwilling to reflect on the weaknesses of that and who they are now. Right? Generally, they'll go, okay, that kind of worked. Avoided a few things there, maybe a bit lucky there, but this is the formula I'm going to apply. Right? And if they don't get it right, they can often say, government changed policy. There was a problem with the shareholders. It was internal politics. Right? It's someone else's fault. So it's very hard for those people to learn. And so again, what I see quite a lot, and I used to be in a major, large executive search firm, otherwise called headhunters, and so you see a lot of senior executives who are really successful in organization A, and maybe they've, for whatever reasons, that has come to an end, and they're now looking around for something else, and they have one formula for how they think about operating, because that's what made them successful in company A. That doesn't equal this is going to make them successful in today's world in company B. But they don't know how to do something different, right? So the biggest feedback I would say, and again, I have all these like one-liners, but my one-liner for all these executives out there and so forth, if you're between jobs, just to be clear, or getting frustrated where you are, is you've got to surf every wave. Mm-hmm. Don't wait. Just because you were a brilliant surfer on one wave, right? You got a long way with that. That was great. Don't paddle around the ocean forever looking for the next perfect wave to come along.
Brilliant.
Yeah, what you want to be doing is surfing every way. If you're in an organization, you've got to understand. You should be investing massively in understanding how to improve the repertoire of your leadership styles and formulas. So that means making sure you're really investing in yourself. That goes back to the accelerate thing we were talking about before. But we get lazy. We're working on the business, we're doing it in the business. Do I really have time to work on myself as well? And why should I? Because it's not broken, so why fix it? But that's the problem. If you're not equipping yourself and evolving and extending your repertoire out, you're making yourself more and more fragile. So yeah, this idea of surf every wave.
Brilliant. That's a great line to finish with, Steve. I don't know whether we give names to these podcast editions, but this episode we'll call it "Surf Every Wave." What a great line, and I do think it's bringing back the sporting, whether it's polo that you mentioned or chess or football that I mentioned. Yeah, we do analyze deeply after every game, right? What worked, what didn't, how do we learn from this? And of course, we can get lots of match practice, so to speak, in these sports, but how to do it, how to get enough experience as a leader. And I think looking for the waves and surfing of them, every one of them, that's a great line to finish with, Steve. But I'd like to finish, Steve, by saying thanks again. We could have filled a whole series with this discussion with you. We'll squeeze it into one episode. But sincerest thanks again for so much wisdom and so much practical sharing. Much appreciated, Steve.
It's a pleasure. Wishing you luck. Thank you.